Well, it's a great pleasure to be speaking with Mauro Biglino once again. He and I have intersected on different projects in the past. We recorded a series of documentaries concerning keywords in the Bible and how they might be interpreted. And I can certainly say, for my part, Mauro has been a great encouragement to me because his credentials in the world of Bible translation are beyond reproach. And so I find it encouraging that someone as intelligent and as accomplished as Mauro reaches conclusions very similar to mine. I think we're probably about 90% agreed in the conclusions we reach, using slightly different approaches, but yet when we apply our logic to the texts, we find ourselves on similar ground. But we're talking today because we want to pay tribute to Erich von Däniken, who recently passed away. He was significant in my own journey, and Mauro, I believe he was significant in yours too. So I thought we could compare notes on our connection with Erich and how he contributed to your journey and to mine.
You, Eric, and me have a similar trait. We have an humanistic cultural background, and so we have a similar methodology to approach the ancient text. We have to pay respect to Eric because he was a very courageous man and also a generous man. He was really a pioneer in this field. Me and Eric, for example, had two paths of research. My path was above all philologic, and his path was to explore on the field, to encounter scholars, to encounter natives, to hear their traditions. But I know that you also move around the world, researching the proof of our ancient past, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. I think for you and for me and for Eric, our journeys into this field really began with words. Because for Eric, it was when he was at school in Switzerland, at high school, at his Jesuit high school, that he started translating texts of the Bible into different languages and then back into Hebrew or back into Greek. And it was there where his curiosity really started. And one of the masters at the school encouraged Eric's curiosity. And he told Eric, you should go to the university library in town in Fribourg and speak to my fellow Jesuit brother, ask him to show you the Book of Enoch. And what you see in that will really excite you. So for Eric, it began in words and translation. This is the ground we all share. And then, of course, Eric traveled the world and he did study indigenous story and he looked for archaeological evidences. And so I relate to that. My first love is language. I learnt French, German, Latin at school, went on to learn Italian in the past, nel passato,
Okay.
and then Portuguese, and then New Testament Greek. And that was my way in. But now I also travel the world. I go to archaeological sites, I listen to indigenous story, and I find the connections. But you're right to say that Eric really was the pioneer of this field, not only in bringing these topics together and proposing unfamiliar conclusions, but I think also his great success was getting these ideas out to the general public. And that really had not happened before Eric. We had Velikovsky, we had the ideas of Sitchin, but it was Erich von Däniken who put these questions to the general public in a way that became part of mainstream conversation.
Oh, yes, he had the courage to pose many questions to the community, especially to the scientific community. I think there is another curiosity. You, Eric, and me had another common characteristic. Of course, you studied with the priest. Eric studied with the Jesuits. I studied my high school with the priest. And so we have
Yes,
the same common background. And
yes,
this background led us how to relate to the ancient text, how to read them, how to pay respect to the ancient authors, because we need to have respect for ancient authors for what they wanted really to tell us.
yes,
Because
exactly.
we all think that the
Yes,
ancient texts are historical documents. And so we learned how to relate with these historical documents and how to, for example, distinguish between the literal writings and the later interpretation. I read many times in your books, and I know that Eric promoted some of your books. So it's important this behavior in relation with ancient authors to try to understand what they really wanted to tell. You, Eric, and me agree with the fact that the ancient humanity had a contact with an higher civilization.
esatto, sono d'accordo.
Okay, perfecto. I apologize for my English.
Very good. I think you're right. I find that often people respond to you and to me and to Eric as if we are attacking the foundations of religion, and we're really not doing that. We are going to the texts because we want to understand them. We want to
Exactly.
understand what they say. We want to understand the history of the texts. And just as you said, Mauro, we want to understand what the writers intended to communicate, because sometimes we have lost that through the work of translation through the ages. And it is such a gift that we can still go to Hebrew texts and we can go to Greek texts and we can ask the question, did we get that right? What does that word really mean?
Oh,
What
yes,
does this phrase really mean?
yes,
And so
absolutely.
both of us, we take that approach. We're not driven by a desire to dismantle anyone's particular set of beliefs, but rather to go to the sources and say, what does this text really say? Is it possible that we have misunderstood? And I often tell religious believers who get upset with me, I say, you might be surprised if you send an email to your local university theology faculty and ask these questions, you may be surprised at how much they agree with what Mauro and I are saying. Ask the professors, are El Elyon, El Shaddai, Yahweh, El, Adonai, Elohim, Yahweh, are they all the same entity? Ask them, does the word Elohim mean God? Ask them, are any of the Hebrew Elohim stories dependent on Ugaritic stories of Bana Elam or dependent on ancient Mesopotamian stories of
Yes, of course.
Tingir and Anunnaki? You will be very surprised when you hear their answers. because the answers they will hear will be something they won't have heard in church or they may not have heard in synagogue. But at an academic level, people engage with these questions. And in your work and my work, we're wanting to bring the implication of those questions to the general public. And so, just as Eric did, to make this part of mainstream conversation.
Oh, yes, I remember that I heard that Eric said that often academics agree with him, but they
In private.
don't want to be public.
Exactly, exactly.
They agree with him only in private discussion,
The,
in private conversation. And
yeah, I have my reputation.
okay, I have a reputation. I have a career. This is very, very interesting to know.
Yes, it was very much a part of his experience through the decades that all kinds of academic authorities, theological, scientific, archaeological, anthropological, they would say to him in private, I have something that supports your case, and I think you are right in what you are saying. And then, just as you said, Mauro, they would then say, please don't quote me. Don't mention my name. And when I asked Eric if he found that frustrating, he said no. And he would never break that trust because he was getting so much information, because he was willing to keep the trust of those people. But I must say, I was annoyed when I discovered that in secret, Carl Sagan agreed with Eric's conclusions. In his mature life, he would never admit to it. In the 1960s, Carl Sagan had written and published papers and books arguing for what Eric was saying, arguing for the Sumerian stories being about ET visitors or non-human visitors or prior civilizations, and that this was something we should explore. But he later charted a different course with his academic career, and he would not support Eric publicly. And in fact, he made fun of Eric publicly. And then at the other end of his career, he wrote a fiction, Contact, where I think we really hear Carl Sagan's heart, what he thought might be the case, but he would never present it as science, but he would present it as fiction. And when you look at Carl Sagan at the end with his fiction and at the beginning with his books and papers, you realize behind closed doors he was in support, so much so that when the Apollo astronauts were doing their missions to the moon, it was Carl Sagan who was briefing them with code words should they experience contact with other civilizations en route. So that's how involved Carl Sagan really was in the ideas of Erich von Däniken, but he would never own up in public.
That give us conviction to go on
Yes, it does. Yes.
because we know that Eric had the courage to confront with this academic and had also the characteristic to pose the right questions.
Yes.
Not only answers which were often provocative, but overall to pose questions to whom the scientific academics are not able to give a satisfying answer. And it's important to have the courage to work also with a little of fantasy because the science needs fantasy.
Yes, that's right. And we need speculation as well. It has its place because what I learned from Eric is really about the role of the writer, that it is the writer's role to move the conversation forward, whether that is to point to the implications of data or to speculate about the implications of data so that the writer puts the ideas on the table and then the academics can come and discuss it. The academics can say, what has this crazy Mauro said, or this crazy Paul, or this crazy Eric said? And they can discuss the ideas and they might say, well, actually, he has some points here.
I read that also in your books that succeed to you to speak with your colleagues, for example, if I remember, and they said you probably maybe you can be right. They are used to read the ancient text with the glasses of theologians. So we are free to speculate, but speculate on the basis of what is literally written in the
Yes,
ancient text. And I
yes,
think this is fundamental because if
definitely.
we think that when the author writing a thing wanted to say another thing, we are not right. We are speculated with too many fantasy. First of all, we need to pay attention to what is really written in the books. You before quoted the book of Enoch, and the book of Enoch is very interesting about that. We have to know it because the book of Enoch is more modern. But
Yes.
of course, the ancient authors wrote books with the words which were available in that time for them. And now we have other words. With them, we are able to describe better what they saw and what they wrote.
That's right. So I often tell people that a key to reading these ancient texts is to approach them pictorially. Yes, it's about words, but if we can listen to these accounts and picture them in our minds as the writers describe them, and then ask ourselves, what language would we use to describe what we've just seen? And of course, we have language from the world of cosmology, astrophysics, the worlds of technology that enable us to give different labels to things that are in the text. You know, we have a word for a craft, we have a word for a rocket, we have a word for a disintegrator if we're talking about weapons, a word for wormhole, so on and so forth. And it would be quite fair to suggest these words in some of the texts, but words which were unknown 500 years ago. Something I wanted to mention about Eric that I think a lot of people might not know or might have forgotten. Not only did Eric write 49 books, but he also led people on tour around the world to very interesting archaeological sites. And he spent a lot of his decades responding to invitations to go and speak either publicly or privately. And so he would speak at museums, at universities, privately with groups involved in the military or military intelligence. And I think it's good to point that out that, for instance, NASA took Eric's work very seriously and they wanted to talk to him about his work. The military took his work seriously and they
That's
wanted to talk
true.
to him about his work. So I think a lot of people don't know how seriously his work was taken. He's known for his ideas, but a lot of people don't know that these ideas were responded to in such a serious way by organizations like that.
What is important, I think, is that Eric didn't work with ego. He
No,
thought that was important to share the knowledge with all people because he spoke often, and I heard that also in your interview, about the so-called zeitgeist. He,
Yes,
he often used this term, the zeitgeist, the spirit of time, and
yes,
he said that the spirit of time is now ready to know the possible truth about the
yes.
origin of humanity. I remember his generosity when during many of the visit I had the fortune to make at his studio, at his home, when he showed me the immense amount of material he had in his studio, 200,000 slides. And he told me, because he was very generous, he told me it's all at your disposal.
Oh, wonderful.
For me was a proof of trust.
Yes.
And in effect, the book we wrote together, Skies Afire, wasn't born as a project conceived at a desk, but as a natural conclusion of many, many conversations.
Oh, wonderful.
He was a very pleasant person.
I was going to ask you about Skies of Fire because I just think it's so lovely and so appropriate that Eric's final book was written with you. And I wanted to ask how you feel, how that makes you feel to have been a collaborator in his swan song book.
Oh, yes, we collaborated, as I said before, with many conversations in which each of us told about our ideas. But what was important is that the two paths led us to a similar point of convergence. That is the question: how are we sure to have really understood what the ancient authors wanted to say to their leaders and now to say us? This book was a really a great effort, and I want to thank the publishing house Tutti because Eric demonstrate a great trust on us when we brought the first copy printed in English, Skies Afire, at his home. I remember Eric was very, very happy
Oh, that's
because
wonderful.
he loved the way we made this book. He loved that this book was the proof that how different paths of research can lead to a similar or often to a same conclusion.
Yes, yes, that's right.
You use the two paths. You use the philology, reading the ancient text, but you also are moving on the world with other
That's right.
people. And
And
so we can really work together. And I
uh,
think this is the best way to pay respect and to honor the memory of Eric.
I couldn't agree more. I was so impressed with Eric's generosity in his later life in encouraging the next generation of researchers and writers. And just like you were saying, Mauro, there was no sense of ego, as if he owned the subject or as if he were a gatekeeper. No, he was a tremendous encourager. All those who came after him and followed in his footsteps and did their own research in these kinds of fields. So I was impressed with his generosity, his encouragement. I was impressed when he recorded a series of interviews on his channel, which were really a matter of him promoting the work of other people. In fact, he was a little bit impatient if people started praising him and his work. The purpose was to shine a light on new researchers, new writers. I was very impressed with that.
Can you remember the titles of the two books that he promoted?
Yes, the first book I wrote in paleo contact was called Escaping from Eden, and it produced a German edition called Flucht aus Eden. And Eric wrote the foreword to that book. And then the sequel to that book was The Scars of Eden. And Eric wrote the endorsement for the cover of that book. And our conversation appears in that book. Also, in the Eden Conspiracy, there's a conversation I had with Eric that's included in the text of that book. And he was very gracious in enabling all that for me and being willing to promote me in that way and allowing me to include material that we had recorded together. I'm in his debt for that. And for me, I first encountered Eric when I was 11 years old. And so he had been in my head for decades and decades before I started writing. And so to finally meet him and work with him and have his encouragement and his endorsement, it was almost like the affirmation of a parent for me, hearing that from
Was
him.
your mother, if I remember exactly?
Well, my mother and father were both very encouraging in this area.
Okay.
They had a copy of Chariots of the Gods
Yes.
on our coffee table, which I read when I was 11. But then my mother was wonderful in encouraging my curiosity. So after Chariots of the Gods, she brought me a book called Supernature about scientific mysteries around the world. And then she bought me a book called The World Atlas of Mysteries by Francis Hitching, which looked at the work of Velikovsky, looked at cryptology, looked at mysteries of ancient sites. And so my mum could see I was curious and was doing what she knew how to encourage me in that direction, to know that there are so many questions that remain unanswered, so many mysteries to be explored. And all this was happening when I was about 11, 12 years old. I remember we all went to India and we purposely visited sites that had been mentioned in Chariots of the Gods so that we could see them for ourselves. It was something we spoke about. My parents were not embarrassed to talk about Eric's work and the ideas in it and to take it seriously. And so I think that was a huge permission giving to me to continue these explorations.
It was marvelous, of
And I
course.
want to ask you, Mauro, when did you first discover Eric for yourself?
I think when I was very young, I was 25 or 30, he had the curiosity because I wasn't satisfied by the answer that the church gave to the many problems that the text pose because it's important to know that often the text don't give answers but pose questions. But that is, and so we have the pleasure to work with depth, without dogma, without the
Yes.
certainty to have the truth, but always with open mind, just like Eric had a very open mind, and he was disposable to recognize his mistakes,
Oh,
and
yes.
he accepted the critics when the critics
Yes.
were constructive.
Right.
Because, as you said before, he, you, and me don't want destroy absolutely the ancient text, but instead, I would say we would reconstruct the real meaning of the ancient text.
Yes. Yes, that's right. I like that you mentioned that about Eric's attitude to mistakes. I heard him say once, I have to keep writing because I need to correct all my mistakes. And that takes a lot of courage to make your mistakes in public and to return to them to correct them. And I think what's wonderful about that is that you're sharing the journey if you do that. I try to do the same. In the Scars of Eden, I had to correct a mistake I'd made in escaping from Eden. And I think when we do that, we are inviting the reader to go on a journey with us. In fact, at the beginning of Escaping from Eden, I suggest some ideas, and then towards the end of the book, I'm saying, actually, I don't think it is that. I think it's this. And so the reader can see I'm making progress through the book. And as they follow
Oh,
from book to book, oh, yes, I'm making progress. I've changed my mind on a couple of things. And not only are you sharing the journey and showing that you're not perfect, you don't know everything, you are learning, but it means your reader has to be open-minded. It's not going to serve your reader to agree with everything you say. My purpose as a writer is to share the questions
oh yes.
with the reader, share my answers tentatively, because next year I might want to finesse what I said before. And so that's why I'm writing a series of books, not one book, because I have to correct my mistakes. I
The
have to keep
series of
learning.
Eden, the series of Eden.
The,
I of course
exactly.
read many of your books, which are very, very interesting. Are always here
Yours,
because
yours are just over my shoulder.
sometimes I return to search some part you wrote, just as the books of Eric are very useful in order to understand some part of the Bible, what the ancient biblical authors wrote.
I love comparing notes with you, Mara. This is one of the reasons I'm very happy to have your books on my bookcase because I often go to them just to follow your logic on texts that I might have an interest in. Because one of the things I love about your approach and your style is that your logic is relentless and that there's you make no sort of leaps, you make no wild speculations. It's here's the text, here are the words, let's pursue them. Let's see
Yes.
where this goes. And the phrase is you take no captives. You just keep going with your logic until you have shown that in the text there is a case for reading it completely differently to how we've read it before. And I love that approach. I find you have a lovely sense of humor in the way you do it as well. And I think it's very important. I mean, if you don't entertain your reader, they won't read your book. And I think the way you entertain your reader is your superb logic, but I do find this lovely humor in the way you write as well, and it always draws me in. So I can never read just a couple of pages of your books, Maro. I'll always end up reading the whole chapter.
Thank you very much. I also think it's important to know your books and books of Eric because both contains the result of your journeys around the world. I remember your journeys in Turkey, for example. Here in this book, there are many images
Yes,
of Eric, and in your book are descriptions of the sites you
the
visited.
sites.
They contains many term
Yes,
to what I was thinking. Simply reading what is written in the Bible or in other tales, but it's very interesting to find in your books and in the books of Eric the concrete proof of what the ancient authors wrote.
yes. I am taking people to Turkey every year now on tour because I want to show people these sites and the carvings left behind. So we have cuneiform inscriptions and we have symbols left behind. And the stories told by the symbols you can find in Turkey, Armenia, Iran, and they tell the same deep story, which I find to be repeated in the biblical texts. And so it's great to be able to stand in a place, look at an ancient site, look at ancient carvings, and it's a way of really being enveloped in the stories so that it's not just words on a page, but you're seeing in concrete form, in hard copy, something that people thousands of years ago wanted us to know. And they wanted us to know so badly, they carved it into basalt so that the stories would survive. So
Yes.
I'm finding that aspect of the work really exciting.
And I think that the descriptions that you wrote in your books is very clear. The description of those carvings are very well described, and so it seems to be there. When
Yes, good.
I read your book, I really think to be there because are very, very clearly described. They are the proof of what the ancient people saw and wanted to record on the rocks in order to maintain the memory of extraordinary events.
Yes, that's exactly right. I did think about putting pictures in my book, The Eden Enigma, but I've never done pictures before and I wasn't sure how complicated it would be. And so I've tried to paint a picture with words each time and give people the feeling of being there. So I'm very happy to hear you saying
And
that.
you did it perfectly.
Thank
You
you. Well, that is lovely to hear. You and I, Mauro, will continue to honor Eric by continuing to work in this field, and we're going to continue with our collaborations, aren't we?
continuing this work is the best method to honor
Yes,
the memory of Eric.
yes, I absolutely agree. And we should also say a huge thank you to Ramon Sucher, who has facilitated Eric's work and has in that way made such an enormous contribution already. And I find him to be, again, somebody not driven by ego, somebody who's very easy to work with and collaborate with. It's been my pleasure to know him as well. And of course, our hearts go out to him and to Eric's family, all his colleagues, all his friends, because it feels almost like a rite of passage. Eric has died, and it's a moment of generational shift that I think a lot of us are feeling.
Yes. So we'll continue a book together. Thanks you for this very pleasant conversation. And I hope that we have really honored the memory of this great person who was Erich von Däniken.
Thank you, Mauro. It's been a pleasure. I'm glad we've been able to do this. It felt appropriate we should do something to mark this moment and honor Eric, someone who's been so significant to both of us and a great friend to both of us.
We have to pay respect to the thought of the zeitgeist. The zeitgeist is ready for understand our past, understand the origin of humanity. Bye. Bye to
Thank
you.
you.
Bye to
Ciao.
your
Bye.
listener. Ciao, 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 ciao. Ciao to all.